just a reminder now, I'll say this now in case I forget, that after tonight, LiFT goes on a 2-week break. So we don't meet for the next 2 weeks, and then when we come back again after 2 weeks, we're on to the final block of sessions, which is amazing. And there are only 6 sessions in the final block. And you may have received some information about the celebration service that we're planning. But just in case you haven't, make sure you can reserve in your diaries the date of November the 25th, which is a day that we're hoping to hold a celebration service at St Luke's in Te Kuiti. So hold that date. It's likely that the service will be in the afternoon. That will hopefully allow time for people to travel. So hopefully as many of us who have participated in LiFT, either on the Tuesday evening or on the other times, will be able to come together for a kind of celebration, come graduation, should we call it? Yes, I think we should. So that's what we'll be doing then. But anyway, more about that to come. So without further ado, I'm going to say good evening to our friends in Dinsdale. We're going to wave from this end. Again, we can't see you, Dinsdale, but we know you're there, so it's great to see you. Good evening to our friends in Tokoroa. Good to see you. Good evening to our friends in Waihi. Excellent. Heather, I think you're going to win the award for the most enthusiastic waver. But that's one other feature that we might have of LiFT. The Bishop will be awarding extra special prizes for particular effort. So at the moment, Heather, you're streets ahead on the waving front, which is brilliant. Good evening to Vincent and Kath in Harborough. If you're not logged on now, hopefully you'll be catching up with us during the week. It's good to have you with us as always. Good evening to our friends in New Plymouth. Great to see you all. Good evening to our friends in Morrinsville. Lovely to see you again. And good evening to our friends in Taumaranui. Great to see you all. And as always, hello to those groups who are doing LiFT at other times in the week, to our friends at Hamilton Cathedral with Susan, New Plymouth, Helene, Raglan, Jan, Kathleen, Jackie, Christy and others in Te Kuiti, to Susanna in Kawhia, hello to you, to Pip in Hawera, and finally to Pamela in Te Aroha and anyone else doing LiFT at another time. Fantastic. So, tonight we've reached the end of our Block 2 journey, and this evening we're going to be focusing on the theme of Christian vision and discipleship. And in a sense, this does connect somewhat with sessions that we've had in the past, particularly if you remember right at the start of LiFT, we spent some time thinking about what discipleship is. So after all of the sessions that we've encountered during this block, and we've done remarkably well, I think, to bear with a lot of the heavy doctrinal stuff, it's quite good to end on a somewhat lighter note, but also to think a little bit about how your understanding of your faith has been enhanced, affected or otherwise by what we've delved into by way of the specifics, by looking at theology and doctrine. So we're going to start tonight with two things. One that just helps us reflect specifically on last week's session where we looked at the sacraments, and then we're going to spend a bit of time reflecting on, I guess, the whole journey of this second major block of teaching and learning. So let's, as we always do, take some time in your groups just to share with each other some reflections on your understanding of Eucharist and baptism and the sacraments that we looked at last week. So if you have a conversation and discussion about that now, I'll be back with you in about 10 minutes or so. So see you shortly. I was just sharing with the folk here in Charlotte Brown House, thinking about that, that table on page 32 with the ebb and flow of the Eucharist service in that case, and the parish visit that I did on Sunday to a parish which shall remain nameless, I suppose, for no particular reason. But anyway, and we sang the song with the chorus "Refiner's Fire." I don't know if any of you have come across that particular song. But anyway, we sang that song, "Refiner's Fire." And I got into the pulpit to preach, and the fire station siren, which is situated right next to the church, promptly went off. So I had to start shouting my sermon. Now, I'm not a shouty preacher. Those of you who've heard me preach kind of know that I'm generally quite measured in the pulpit, but in this particular case I had to start shouting quite loudly because I was competing with the fire service siren that seemed to go on forever. And in that case, the sermon bit of the Eucharist suddenly was kind of elevated up to a high point because of the fact that I was in the pulpit shouting with the fire siren going off. Anyway, there we go. But perhaps you might be able to reflect each week when you yourselves perhaps experience the Eucharist. How is this liturgy unfolding, and how am I a part of it? Am I apart from it, or am I apart from it, if you see what I mean? How can I myself feel a full participant in what is happening? So let's take some time now to think more broadly about the sessions that we've encountered during the last few weeks. We've done quite a lot, actually, haven't we? We've delved into theology and doctrine. We had that very powerful session with Nira about our Tikanga Rua relationships. And we've also thought about mission and evangelism. So I wonder if you could take some time now in your local groups just to name perhaps one session that has stood out for you for whatever reason, and what difference you think that your learning in that can make to the local community of which you are a part. Okay, so just take some time now to share some reflections on the past sessions, and is there one in particular that has stood out for you, and how is that impacting in your local community? And I'll be back with you shortly. So let's move now into thinking a little bit about discipleship, and particularly thinking about the role of imagination. Often when we think about the disciples and the theme of discipleship in general, I'm not sure that the word imagination would necessarily be on the top of our list of words that we associate with either the disciples or the process and the journey of discipleship that we are ourselves participants in. But actually, if you look at the way in which Jesus gathered his disciples and the way in which he taught them, particularly using the parables, they were very much exercises in expanding the imagination. If we understand imagination as to be the sort of the creativity, the potential for creativity in each one of us, we've all got that. And one of the great things about the disciples is that they were a relatively they were an interesting group of people, let's put it that way. Often not the most, the usual people that I guess you would have expected Jesus to gather around him, but Jesus believed in them and believed in their potential. And I think it's fair to say that likewise God believes in us, and God believes in our potential, and that each one of us has within us the capacity to be people of imagination and creativity. But often we're quite quick to shut that down, I think, sometimes. And dare I say, sometimes we're quick to shut it down in other people for whatever reason. But actually the church should be a place that really fosters and encourages imagination and creativity in all sorts of ways. Much because if we link this to our liturgy, actually our liturgy is this kind of multi-sensory, multi-visual, multi-purpose encounter with God's grace week by week. So it's full of imagination and creativity. In preparation for this week, I asked you to have a look at a couple of YouTube clips by Professor Peter O'Connor, who teaches at the University of Auckland, and he came to address our ministry school in New Plymouth recently, and it was a very profound experience. And I think actually that Professor O'Connor is addressing the House of Bishops when we meet next week, which should hopefully also be a really good experience. Now, one of the things that Peter O'Connor talks about and asks us is, where do you keep your imagination? And I find that quite an interesting question. It's quite a challenging question. Where do you keep your imagination? So just take some minutes in your local groups now to answer that question if you can. Where do you keep your imagination? And I'll be back with you shortly. Let's look now at these images that you've got before you on pages 39 onwards. And then I'll get you in your groups just to do some reflecting on them. So these are really an attempt, if you like, to stretch the imagination and link some images to particular biblical passages. So some of these images are quite explicit in what they're depicting, others I've kind of put my own interpretative spin on it. So let's have a look at them. They're all in or they all have been. They all have been in Auckland Art Gallery, by the way, if you ever get a chance to go to Auckland Art Gallery. But anyway, the first image there you can see, which is a painting that's entitled "This Land Is Ours," is a painting that was done following the 1975 hikoi to Wellington, which had to do with the loss of Maori land. So it was a march about that loss and about the desire and the wish to reclaim land. And it's quite a vivid depiction with all sorts of things in it, not all of which you might automatically understand. I certainly don't, but I'm interested nonetheless in the colours and the shapes and the faces of the people. And the image that I've reflected on, the scriptural image, is the story of the Exodus and the journey of the people to a new land. So much less about the loss of land, I suppose, as to the coming into an identity associated with land, which is quite a profound image in our scriptural journey, actually, and one which is the kind of, in the New Zealand context, has a particular gloss and overtone in terms of the disenfranchisement of land. So this links a little bit to some of the reflections that we shared with Nira in our session with Tikangarua relationships. So it's interesting that this is an image that is not explicitly religious. It's certainly not depicted as such in any way, shape or form when you see it in the gallery. And yet when I looked at it, I immediately thought of some of the very strong themes and images in the Bible to do with land, and it then set me off on a bit of a journey, if you like, to uncover some of those themes more explicitly. And so sometimes when we perhaps encounter an image or a theme, that might make you want to delve into exploring scripture in a quite a focused way, and that can be a helpful thing. So that's image number one. Image number two is more explicitly religious, as indeed a lot of Colin McCann's works are. And this one is called "The Days and Nights in the Wilderness." And obviously that's a giant capital I. And it's the sense of I being, well, who or what is the I? On the one hand, is it God? I am. Or is it perhaps ourselves, thinking about, well, who are we? Who are we in relationship to God? And of course, that big question of identity that Jesus asks in the Gospels, who do you say that I am? And every time we kind of see that phrase, I am, it's a pretty loaded phrase, because again, it's linking us back to the story of the Exodus and the self-revelation of who God is. God is the essence that is expressed in Jesus Christ. God is Christ, Christ is God. So for me, that's a pretty bold image about identity. It's asking us that question, who are we in relation to God? Who is God? And then perhaps we can think of Jesus asking us, well, who do you say that I am? And that is very much a question of discipleship. There are lots of questions that can define what it means to be a disciple, but certainly that question, who do you say that I am, is a really important question in discipleship, because we have to be able to articulate that somehow if we're going to be disciples. Because if somebody asks us, well, who is Jesus? What do you say? So who do you say that I am? The third image is a little more challenging, I guess, and interesting at the same time. And this is a painter who is deliberately, I guess, doing his own take on the image below. So the bottom image is the 16th century Italian painting, and the artist has taken this kind of style of depicting Jesus and reworked it in his own way, and it's quite a dark image, has to be said, but it's kind of the artist interpreting another artist who's depicting Jesus, if that makes sense. So that's quite a challenge, because that also is a question around imagination and discipleship. You know, if you had to yourself try and depict Jesus, how would you depict Jesus? I suppose in a way that's a question I've never really asked myself. I'm asking that to myself right now for the first time, thinking, well, yeah, okay, how would I seek to depict Jesus? If I was going to take this 16th century painting and kind of do my own take on it, what might that look like? So sometimes our images of Jesus can be unsettling, and they can unsettle us. I find that image at the top there quite unsettling. So it's an image that I go back to and think, it'd be quite interesting to have a conversation with the artist and understand. But the whole method there of art, interpreting who Jesus is an exercise in imagination and discipleship. Number 4 on the top of page 41 is probably my favourite, and unfortunately this is a still image. This is a video installation, actually, which probably if you were to try and Google it, you might be able to pull it up. But it basically depicts these two people trying to get a piano up a narrow sort of, spiral staircase. And again, not explicitly religious, but when I looked at it, I immediately thought of the image of trying to fit a camel through the eye of the needle. Just watching these piano movers try and manoeuvre this piano up a stair reminded me of that, and it kind of almost made me look at that passage, the camel through the eye of the needle, with almost like a comedy slant, because I thought, well, that's crazy. And I wonder if sometimes perhaps we downplay the potential for humour in Scripture, and some of the outlandish images that Jesus would have used. For example, if you listen to the Gospel reading on Sunday, the whole idea of the slave owing 10,000 talents, I mean, that is a huge, vast amount of money, so over the top, it kind of would make you chuckle. So we need to think as well in our vision and our imagination and thinking about discipleship. Well, what is the role of humour in this? How can we use images to garner a sort of reaction that can be creative? And for me, that piano moving is quite a creative thing. I don't know if you ever tried to move a piano, anybody, but they're jolly heavy. My husband's college in Oxford recently, they have a restored Steinway piano in the chapel, and a couple of the ladies who work in the college decided they need to move the piano a bit to dust, the floor. Well, they moved the piano and one of the legs fell off. So this massive grand piano was kind of, you can imagine a grand piano tipped. Thankfully, nobody was injured. But if you're familiar with any of the Inspector Morse programmes, because this was in an Oxford college, and it had sort of, not exactly police line, but it had tape around it. I thought, well, they should have just stuck a kind of mannequin underneath it and called it Inspector Morse to kind of sort it out. But anyway, that's a complete aside, which has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with discipleship, but there we go. It's about a piano. Right, moving down number 5, which is an image that's more explicitly religious, and indeed it tells us Jonah and the great fish. So, which is an artist working in the 1950s who, depicts quite an interesting image there of Jonah almost bound up as part of the giant fish. But you get a sense of the drama of that narrative. And what sort of struck me about it was the almost the sort of upside down nature of Jonah. It's not a kind of neat picture. It's Jonah's kind of tumbling around and in the whole process of being swallowed up by the big fish. So again, stretching our imagination to think about what some of the stories, particularly in the Old Testament, might look like. Sometimes it's easier to get into a story if we think about it visually rather than just the words on the page. So that's quite a good one too. Over the page now to number 6, and again another image by Colin McCann, again quite explicitly connected with the creation story in Genesis 1, 6 days in Nelson and Canterbury. So 6 images, 6 days, and quite interesting actually in how what are the subtle differences and the similarities in those images. What is that telling us about the process of creation? Sometimes we think of the creation story as being, well, it is quite clearly delineated, isn't it? But what are the subtleties in creation? The things that we might not see explicitly, the things that we might miss. What does it mean to pay attention to detail, for example, as disciples? And that's one of the things that Jesus taught the disciples to do, was to notice things. So how can we use our imagination to notice things in our daily journeys, our daily lives, things that we might otherwise miss? Image number 7 there on the bottom, again, is another installation that was in Auckland Art Gallery, and this is one where you sort of walked in and then looked up. So you had to look up to view this, and you can sort of see by the picture there that it's quite a big installation. It's multi-dimensional. You can see different things in different angles, and there's this rather curious black sort of slightly sinister figure that's kind of going through it. And this particular artist depicted this image as a response to the Tuhoi raid, which you might remember from recent years. And so it's a kind of it's the artist's response to persecution, and it's a protest, and you've got to look up to kind of see it. And when I encountered that particular image, I immediately thought of the book of Revelation, which is so full of, as we've seen, because we had a whole session on it, so full of imagery that's very hard to understand, but which nonetheless is itself a response to persecution, and in itself might be described in some way as a kind of protest against the might of the Roman Empire. It's a very visual, multi-dimensional book, Revelation, which in some ways might be better depicted visually rather than just words on a page. So think of that stretching of the imagination to visualise things which seem strange or difficult to understand. And the 8th image there on the top of page 43 is one of Gordon Walter's many images of the koru. If you know the artist Gordon Walters, you will know that he paints the koru in lots of different ways. But the thing that intrigued me about this was that it made me think about that particular type of interpretation that, again, we looked at a few weeks ago, the black fire and the white fire, both of equal meaning. So in this picture, there's a balance between the black koru and the white koru, both of equal meaning. Text plus interpretation gives meaning. So when we use our imagination as disciples, we are actually encountering text in a way that is creative. So, if you take some time now just to consider those images in your groups, is there any one that you find intriguing or particularly interesting? And is this a method that you would find helpful yourselves in thinking about how you use the imagination to encounter and expand your understanding of what it is to be a disciple? So take some time in your groups now to consider those images and what they say to you about imagination and discipleship, and I'll be back with you soon. Let's crack on. As usual, we're running out of time because I packed so much into these sessions, but anyway, that's fine. We've got work to do over the next couple of weeks during our break. For this week, you had to read pages 94 to 100 in John Pritchard's book, and we don't often do this in LiFT actually, but I thought tonight we would, simply because this theme of doing justice is one that is really important in the journey of discipleship, and it's often also one that requires imagination and creativity. For example, how do we here engage with global issues of justice? How do we engage with community issues of justice in the places where we live? That, I think, is one of the really important mandates of what it is to be a disciple. So I'd like you to spend some time now in your groups just reflecting with one another about these few pages from John Pritchard's book, and thinking particularly about how you would do justice in your community. Is there an issue in your community that requires or that invites a discipleship response? Those of you in Morrinsville, for example, you were in the news headlines, not you personally, I don't think, but Morrinsville was in the news headlines yesterday, of course, with the farmers' protest by the imagination-enhancing giant cow in Morrinsville, which I drove past the other day and thought, wow, that's an exercise in the imagination, if ever there was one. But that's an issue of local justice for some. So how can the church respond and encounter these sorts of issues, particularly at the moment with the general election in progress? So just take a bit of time now before we wrap up with some of these biblical texts at the end to think about the John Pritchard chapter and how you would respond to do justice in your community where you are. And I'll be back with you again soon. I don't have time right now to do justice to all these biblical passages, so I'm going to set you a task to do over the next couple of weeks. In a sense, I've chosen these passages because they're about different aspects of discipleship that invite the imagination to respond. Because if we're going to be disciples in a practical sense in our everyday lives, then we need to think quite carefully about what that means for us personally. And you've got to use your imagination to try and make those connections. And it's in doing that you actually begin to shape a sense of what vision is. The vision is set because we follow Christ, but what does that actually look like for ourselves personally? And I'm not saying that all of these passages and their themes are going to speak to all of you equally, but there may be one that you find intriguing, or the one that you know will speak quite helpfully into an aspect of your daily life. So what I'd quite like you to do in the next couple of weeks is, if you can, and you can do some reflection on this in your journal if you're able to, is to take one of these passages and just sit with it, dwell with it for a while, and really think about how you would shape your own vision of discipleship in your own life, in your community. Might be, for example, that you know that you're good at doing hospitality, or that your community is good at doing hospitality. Or celebrate that. I think being a disciple is also about celebrating the gifts that we have, that we know we can bring to the table, and rejoice because God has given us those gifts. So take some time over the next couple of weeks to identify one of these passages and themes that you think will speak to you particularly, and we'll pick that up again when we come back. So try not to forget to do it. Make a note to come back to that at some point over the next 2 weeks. Thank you all so much for bearing with what has been quite an intense few weeks. It's amazing that we've managed to cover such a huge spread of particularly doctrine. I think if you've survived that, you can survive pretty much anything. so well done everybody for bearing with it. When we come back in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be launching into another section of teaching, and the workbooks for that will be forthcoming probably the week after next. So in anticipation of those coming, just work on your vision and discipleship and keep your journal going. So thanks again everybody for your attention and your patience, and it's been great to have you again with us. So I'm going to say good night from Hamilton to our friends in Dinsdale. We can, well, you're not a blank screen, but it's good to see the wall anyway, on the light and the window. So it's great to have had you with us. Good night to our friends in Tokoroa. Good night to our friends in Waihi. Yes. Excellent. Good night to our friends in Harborough, to Vincent and Kath. Hopefully you'll watch us during the week at some point. Good night to our friends in New Plymouth. Good night to our friends in Morrinsville. Awesome, great to see you. And good night to our friends in Taumarunui. So don't forget, 2 weeks' time, good night and farewell to all of those groups doing LiFT at other points in the week. Don't forget, we've got a 2-week break, and we'll be back together in a couple of weeks' time. 3rd of October, I think it is. Okay. All right, everybody. Good night, and see you soon.